His name was inside the stone. Not carved into the surface, not painted on, not stamped there by any human hand that history recorded. Inside it. Embedded within the material itself. Like the stone had been formed around those letters. Like whatever intelligence created this artifact 11,000 years before Seiran Vale drew his first breath, had already known his name. Had been waiting. And the thing that frightened him most was not the impossibility of what he was seeing. It was the feeling that came with it. Not shock, not wonder. Relief. Because some part of him, the part that 20 years of careful, professional, institutional management had not successfully extinguished, had been waiting for exactly this. But to understand why a man could feel relieved to discover that an ancient artifact had been waiting for him specifically, we have to go back. Back to the beginning of a story that, it turns out, was never really about him being wrong. It was about the fact that he was right, and the people above him knew it. The Vethara Guild maintained 12 archive facilities across the administrative territories. Seiran Vale had worked in the same one for 20 years. He was not considered important, not by the intake registrars who had stopped learning his name sometime during the second decade, not by the senior archivists who wrote his annual performance reviews in fewer words each year, without apparent awareness that the brevity itself was a kind of verdict. Not by whatever committee had, at some point in his career, quietly decided that certain categories of artifact material were above his clearance level, without formally documenting when that decision was made, or why, or whether it had ever been subject to review. He was considered, by institutional consensus, a competent processor, someone who could be trusted to catalog, cross-reference, file, someone who would not, based on 20 years of behavioral evidence, cause problems. What that 20 years of evidence had actually demonstrated was something else. What it had demonstrated was a man who had learned to cause no problems. Those are not the same thing. The file arrived on a Tuesday. It was 43 pages. Seiran had processed thousands of files in his career. He could tell, from the weight of the binding, the specific archival paper stock, the particular shade of institutional gray on the cover, he could tell what category of document he was holding before he opened it. This was a skill, a real one, the kind that accumulates quietly over decades without anyone deciding to formally recognize it. This one was wrong. The binding was correct, the paper was correct, the gray was correct, but something about the way it sat on the table in front of him, the weight distribution, the way the light fell across the cover at a slightly unusual angle for a standard intake document. Something. He had learned, a very long time ago, not to write that word in official reports. He left the file in the center of the table, unopened, and for 37 seconds, he counted, he sat completely still and asked himself whether he was prepared to trust what he was about to see. Then he opened it. The first 11 pages were routine. Intake logs, transfer records, classification amendments, administrative signatures from people who were probably no longer alive. Page 12 was different. It was an anomaly report, filed in the 3rd year of his employment. His employment. Not the artifacts intake record, not the Guild's standard deviation log, not an environmental assessment or a facility irregularity notice. A personnel anomaly report, filed under his name when he was 25 years old. The header read, Anomalous Truth Layer Sensitivity. Classification, internal. Distribution, restricted. Project Kronos Review Committee only. The body of the report described, in precise technical language, a series of observations about what he had reported seeing during his first 3 years of active archive work, about discrepancies between his reports and the reports of other archivists working with identical materials, about what the Senior Review Committee had subsequently concluded about those discrepancies. He read the committee's conclusion carefully. The assessment was not that his reports were inaccurate. The assessment was that his reports were accurate, anomalously accurate, and that this represented a personnel management concern. There had been a morning, he was 27, when he filed a routine classification report about what should have been a standard low-grade artifact. He wrote it exactly as he had observed it. The report described text appearing inside the object's material structure, not on the surface, not a reflection, not degradation patterning, inside. He submitted the report. 3 days later, his supervisor called him in for what the meeting log described as a calibration conversation. He was not disciplined. He was not contradicted. He was not told he was wrong. He was simply, gently, professionally, with complete institutional warmth, invited to reconsider whether his language choices in the report might benefit from more conservative phrasing. More conservative phrasing. So he rewrote it. The version he submitted made no mention of text inside the material structure. It mentioned surface degradation patterns consistent with age-stress fracturing, which was, technically, not false. This happened 4 more times over the following 6 years, each time a little smoother, each time requiring a little less external correction. By year 12, he no longer needed the calibration conversation. He had internalized it. He had become, from the institution's perspective, a reliably conservative reporter. He had, from any other perspective, successfully taught himself to disbelieve what he saw. The memo was on page 19. It was dated 4 months after his first calibration conversation. The subject line read, Project Kronos, Operational Protocols. The clearance level was 4 grades above his current classification. The document had no business being in a personnel file accessible through standard archival intake. He read it slowly. The language was institutional, measured, bureaucratically impenetrable in the specific way that documents are written to be impenetrable to the person they concern. But the content, once you stripped away the administrative shell, was not impenetrable. The content was simple. Subject demonstrates persistent anomalous truth sensitivity. Standard calibration protocols insufficient for full suppression. Subject compensates behaviorally. Underlying perceptual access appears structurally stable. Recommend continued compartmentalization. Continued. Not begin compartmentalization. Not initiate compartmentalization. Continue. Which meant this was not the beginning of a management strategy. It was a progress report on one that was already well underway. In the margin, in handwriting that did not match any signatory on the document, someone had added a single additional line. Do not permit unsupervised archive access above level 7. He had never had level 7 access. In 20 years. He had assumed, without ever examining the assumption, that this was because he was not considered important enough to need it. He understood now that this was precisely the point. He sat with that for a while. There is a particular kind of silence that follows a revelation of this specific shape. Not the silence of surprise, not the silence of grief, not even the silence of anger, though anger was coming. He could feel it gathering somewhere below the processing layer, patient and organizing. This was the silence of recalibration. When a structural assumption you have been building your understanding of yourself on for 20 years is quietly removed, you have to wait for the rest of the architecture to settle before you can take inventory of what remains standing. What he found, in the settling, was that the doubt was gone. Not resolved, not addressed, not answered. Gone. As though it had never belonged to him, as though it had been installed. He had spent 20 years believing that the thing preventing him from trusting his own perception was some deficiency inside himself, some flaw in his attention, his judgment, his professional reliability. He had worked, diligently and with genuine sincerity, to correct that flaw. He had filed conservative reports. He had attended calibration conversations without complaint. He had, on the occasions when he noticed the glow inside certain materials, the light from inside the stone that was unmistakably real and unmistakably not what the catalog described, he had looked away. Made note of surface degradation consistent with age stress fracturing. In his own assessment, he had been getting better. He understood now that he had been getting more manageable. Those are not the same thing. The artifact had been on the table beside him the entire time. It was not, by any technical classification, a notable piece. Medium-grade containment status. Origin, unverified pre-consolidation. Designation, passive inscription object. Notes, no active phenomenological indicators observed during standard intake assessment. He had been assigned to cross-reference its intake documentation against the file. He had not, until this moment, looked at it. When he looked at it, properly, without the filter he had spent 20 years carefully constructing and maintaining, it pulsed. Just once. Cold light from somewhere inside the material. Not on the surface, not a reflection of the archive lamps above, not anything that surface degradation consistent with age stress fracturing would produce. Inside. The same light he had seen a dozen times across a 20-year career. The same light he had carefully, professionally, deliberately not included in his reports each time. The difference, this time, was that he did not look away. The room did something strange. It did not change. Nothing moved. The shelves remained the shelves. The files remained the files. The warm amber light from the overhead fixtures continued doing exactly what it had always been doing. But the room, the totality of the space around him, became contextual. Like a frame around a subject he hadn't yet fully identified. Like everything at the edges of his attention was quietly announcing its own irrelevance. He had tried, once, at 26 years old, to describe this state in a report, before he learned better. The language he'd used then had been inadequate. The language available to him now was more inadequate still. But the experience was not inadequate. The experience was extraordinary in its precision. Like a perceptual instrument he had been sitting on top of for 20 years, carefully, systematically, professionally sitting on top of, had finally been switched on. And the first thing it showed him, in full fidelity, without correction, was that the artifact had been waiting for exactly this moment. The material separated. Not fractured, not cracked under pressure. Separated. As though two layers of the same stone, layers that had been sealed together for longer than human civilization had possessed written language, were parting to show him what had been held between them. All that time. The light was cold, white gold, impossibly steady, the way no fire or lamp was steady. And inside the light, text. Not decorative inscription, not symbolic notation, not the geometric marking that standard classification cataloged as ritual ornamentation to avoid engaging with what it actually was. Text. Readable. Structured. Addressed. At the top, in a formal register he had no vocabulary for but understood immediately, in the way certain things communicate below the level of learned language, there was a designation, an authorization line. And in the authorization line, his name. Seiran Vale. Not a coincidence. Not a translation error. Not a trick of the light on ancient markings that his damaged professional judgment was misreading. His name. His specific, particular, individual name in a document sealed inside stone for 11,000 years. He did not move. He did not speak. He did not reach for the reporting forms. For a very long time, he simply sat with the weight of what was in front of him. The question he had been asking for 20 years, quietly, without ever quite fully articulating it, even to himself, was whether any of it was real. Whether what he saw was actually there. Whether the text inside materials was observation or hallucination. Whether his perception was a skill or a malfunction. He had never been given a definitive answer. He had only ever been given management. The file was management. The calibration conversations were management. The restricted clearance levels were management. The document on page 19 with the phrase, "Continue compartmentalization," was management. 20 years of systematic, professional, institutional management. All of it designed around a single operational premise, that if you kept him busy enough, modest enough, self-doubting enough, careful enough, he would never look at an artifact and actually let himself greet it. He reached forward, slowly. Not the way you reach for something fragile, the way you reach for something significant. His ink-stained fingers settled on the surface of the artifact. The light clarified. And for the first time in 20 years, Seiran Vale did not look away. He let himself read it, properly.